Okay, today's daf we're going to learn today is Eruvin Lamed Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Shapiro for the 7th year at site of her mother, Dira Teichman, Zichrona Livracha. We're going to start. There's a sheet for today if someone wants to put it up in the chat. Okay, we're going to start at the bottom of Lamed Amud Bet. The first thing I want to discuss is what we ended with yesterday, this Ol HaMitaltel. Okay, what is an Ol, right? Ol Zaruk. Actually, Rashi calls it an Ol HaMitaltel. Ol Zaruk is an Ol Zaruk. Remember, we talked about the Kohen. He wants to go into the cemetery. Right? He puts his Eruv in the cemetery. Rabbi Yehuda says it works. Tanakama says it doesn't work. Why does Rabbi Yehuda think it works? Because theoretically, he could go inside a box, right? And basically get inside some sort of enclosed space and get to his stuff. And that will protect him from Tumah. So now they say the machloket between them must be, is Ol Zaruk considered an Ol or not? There's actually a big machloket, Rashi, Rabbeinu Hanana. What exactly is this case of an Ol Zaruk? Is it while it's moving? Or is it just something portable even when it's not moving? Okay, that's a big debate, which is an interesting debate. Does Zaruk mean while it's being thrown or while it's moving or even not? One of the most interesting nafkaminas about this is about airplanes. Okay, this is one of the sugyas when they talk about airplanes and airplanes going over cemeteries, because remember, Tumah goes all the way up to the sky. So would airplanes be what we call chotzetz? What the whole idea here is that it's chotzetz b'fnei tumah. What does that mean? It means that we basically have a space that doesn't itself become impure. Because it doesn't become impure, it basically blocks tumah from coming. I don't want to get into everything, but in Ohalot, there's a Mishnah that says there's some things that are matame and they're chotzetz, and there's some things that are not matame and not chotzetz, and there's like 4 permutations, but let's just say it simply right now that generally if something doesn't become impure itself, then it protects from impurity and it can protect things inside. The question is that only an ohel that's stationary, or does it even mean an ohel that can be movable? So by the way, one of the ways that Rav Lichtenstein looks at this is he said, well, maybe one of the reasons is, and this all, by the way, comes out of the din of ohel. It's like the opposite of din ohel with a mate inside. But it's the same theory, that if you have a dead body inside a tent or a house, then the tumah fills up that whole space and anything in there is tummy. So it's the same kind of idea here, where if you have an ohel and the mate is outside, the ohel can protect. So one of the reasons he says is one of the conceptual ways of understanding is that maybe we view this as when the mate is in the ohel, let's just go to that case, okay? And then we can learn from there to our case, that the mate, this is the mate's location, and therefore this is the makom of the mate. So therefore it fills up the whole space, right? Whereas here also we're going to say this is the makom of the person and it's got its own distinct location, right? And it's distinct from anything outside of it. But that might only be then if it's stationary. If it's moving or if it's something movable, then we might not view it that way, right? That's the question here. Once it moves, it maybe it's not considered a distinct space, or is it? That's part of the question here. Okay, so what we said yesterday was that the whole machloket Rabbi Yehuda Chachamim is dependent on, do we say Ol Zaruk Shmei Ohel or not? So Rabbi Yehuda thinks it counts. So just going back to I'll give you a few of the different opinions about the airplane. There's a lot of different opinions. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some people say that the ohel itself, remember I said, if it becomes tamei, the ohel itself, right, the box or whatever it is, then it won't be able to be chotzetz. So some people say it's made out of metal, and metal is tamei, and therefore everything, it's not going to be able to block tumah from going into the airplane. But I think it's Rav Moshe Feinstein says that the airplane itself is made of aluminum, and aluminum was not a material that was known then from the Torah. So even though it's metal, it's not the metals that were mentioned in the Torah, and therefore wouldn't be. Another reason that Rav Shechter gives is that it's so high up that I think it's Rav Shechter, I hope I'm quoting the right people, but in any case, this is the opinion that it's so high up. Now we say Tuma Ole Levar Larakia. Now imagine, do you think the Gemara thought that people would fly in airplanes? Right? They had no idea. So when they said Adarakia, they didn't mean necessarily, right? They meant up to the heavens. Now when you're, again, what's the sky? Where does the sky start? Once you're in the clouds, so you're already so far away that the Tuma doesn't actually get there. So that's another possible way to find heterium. There are those who think it's a problem. Anyway, there's different opinions, and part of there's a lot more to it than this. I'm kind of giving it to you just really a little taste of the topic. Okay, so now we're going to start from the very bottom of the daf of Lamed Amud Bet. The Hadatanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now we're going to say, so Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, just to remind you, he said, even beber akvarot. Why? Because yachol lachutz velelech b'shidat teva umigdal, right? You can basically create your own boundaries, and you can get to it. Now we're going to see another opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, which is very similar, but it's a little bit different, and we're going to have some questions on this case. Marvin lekohen tahor b'truma tahora bakever. It's a very strange case. A kohen can take pure truma, and he can use it for his eruv if he puts it, even if he puts it on a kever. Okay, this sounds really strange. How could he put truma on a kever? First problem is truma tahora, if you remember. If it becomes impure, what do we do with it? You have to burn it. If you have to burn it, well, then it certainly can't be used as your eruv. It's basically, if you remember, we've talked about this, it's michtat, kitute michtat shiur, right? It's as if it has no shiur of anything because it's supposed to be burned. So it's not even important. It's not anything. So the question is, how does this work? So first they say, hechi azil. So first of all, how does the Kohen get to it if it's in a cemetery? So this we already know. B'shidat teva umigdal. Okay, so the way he would get to it was he would go near the kever with his shidat teva umigdal. Then we're going to have to, number one, answer, how come the truma doesn't become tameh? Then we're going to have to answer, how can he access it? Because he has to get to near the kever, and isn't he going to somehow become tameh that way? So first they answer, first they question, since you're putting the food on the grave, isn't it the food going to become impure? Right? We know the food becomes impure. So what do they answer? It must be a case, remember, in order to become tameh, you have to have a liquid come in contact with it. So in order for the liquid to come in contact, you have to, if a liquid doesn't come in contact with it, then you're not going to be impure. So basically we're going to say that since it wasn't huchshar lekabel tuma, so it would have to be food that can't yet become impure. It's not susceptible to impurity because no liquids came upon it. Oh, sheni lo shabe me perot, or maybe it got wet with fruit juice, and fruit juice is not one of the 7 liquids. Remember, there's 7 liquids. Yad shachat dam, or the rashi tevot for them, the abbreviations for what all of them are, but fruit juice is not one of them, and therefore maybe it got wet with fruit juice, but not anything. Again, it just really means the same answer, which is it's not susceptible to impurity. So we've resolved one issue. Okay, we still have a number of other issues. Now, how is he going to access it? Right? He obviously can't put his hand there. If he puts his hand over the grave, he's certainly going to become tameh. So we assume he uses some sort of utensil. But what's the problem? Again, we're going to have a problem. If he uses a utensil to get it, the utensil is going to become tameh and then make the truma impure. So then we're going to end up with a problem again with the truma. So what do they answer? There's certain types of utensils that don't become tameh. So for example, if you have wooden utensils that are flat, like a flat tray, right? Generally we say, depending on, there's certain things that are flat will become tameh, but pshutei kli'etz have to have a beit kibul, we call it, a receptacle to receive something. If it's flat, it's not susceptible to impurity. So that's what we would do. He'd take a tray, he'd put the tray under the food, get the food. Okay, that seems to work. But then they say, wait a minute, there's a separate problem if he does that. What's the problem? V'ha. What does that mean? Okay, here, if you're looking, you can see this better. I'm going to take my paper. Imagine I take my utensil and I put it over the grave like this. Now, there's a separate halacha, which is, we've learned about ohel. It's not just ohel, but if I have something that's a tefach wide and I put it over the tent, I put it over the dead body, okay? So now, if there's dead body under this paper, let's say on the left side, if there's anything under the right side of this, or even if I'm holding this from the other side, since there's tuma underneath the other side, it basically, and there's a covering over it, it means everything underneath here, or even if I touch the side of it, is going to be impure. So when I'm holding this kli, it's true, my hand is not over the kever, but the other side of this kli is over the kever, so over the grave. So I'm basically going to move, the tumah is going to go onto me, so that's not going to work. So that's what it means, hakam ma'ahil. It creates a tent structure over it, which is going to be a problem. So what do they answer? What you have to do is you have to turn the kli on its side, which is narrow right now. The bottom is narrow. There's not a width of a tefach, and that's how he's going to have to get his food in that way. And that way, there's no ohel situation here because it's not a tefach wide, and that will be our resolution. But then, now we're going to have separate problems. Okay, so we resolved all the technical problems of how on earth would Rabbi Yehuda think that he could do this. But now we're going to have an issue. we just described a perfectly good way. I mean, it might not be, you might not have thought it was a perfectly good way, but seems to be a way that the Kohen could access his Truma Torah, won't become Tameh. He can access it without becoming Tameh himself, without getting the food Tameh. If the utensil doesn't become Tameh, the food won't become Tameh. And we figured out a solution. There's no ohel situation here. We're okay. But there's now a problem. If it's such a good solution, then then why won't the rabbis allow this? So remember, the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. They should say that this works. So the answer given is kasavre asur liknot bayit b'isurei hana'ah. You can't buy a house with things that are forbidden to benefit from. Okay, who's buying a house here? What do they mean buy a house? Well, they're taking the terminology that we've been talking about, kana shvita. When you want to put your eruv somewhere, what are you doing basically? You're saying, I'm buying this space for Shabbat. This space becomes my space for Shabbat. So what it really means is you can't acquire your space for Shabbat using something that's forbidden to benefit from. What here is forbidden to benefit from? A grave. A grave is considered something that's forbidden to benefit from. They learned it from Eglah Arufa. I'm not going to get into the details, but a grave is forbidden to benefit from. Well, what am I doing now? I'm benefiting from it. How am I benefiting? And this goes back to what we saw yesterday. I'm benefiting because I now can walk 2,000 am outside the city because I'm using the grave to house my food. So that's a problem. So that's why the rabbis say it's forbidden. Well, now we're going to say, well, now flip back, ping pong back to Rabbi Yehuda. So first we thought Rabbi Yehuda seemed perfectly a good answer. Then we said, well, the rabbis obviously disagree. So why? They must say because you can't use the grave to get benefit from. Well, then they say, so Michlal to Rabbi Yehuda savar mutal, right? So then Rabbi Yehuda must say it's allowed, right? We know Rabbi Yehuda says it's allowed. So why? He must hold kasavar mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu. This goes back to what we saw yesterday. He must hold, no, your eruv, remember we said, is only for the purposes of a mitzvah. Therefore, by you benefiting that you can walk more than 2,000 amma outside the city because you're using this grave to benefit from, that's not called benefit. Because your benefit is that you get to do a mitzvah. And mitzvah is not considered a benefit. The fact that I've gotten a mitzvah is not considered a benefit. So therefore, it must be he holds mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu. Now, that basically puts us in the position that we're assuming right now. What's the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis? Are mitzvot lehenot nitnu or not? Do we say the fact that you get a mitzvah, you get to do a mitzvah means I've benefited, right? It's a very fascinating question. Is this called benefit to me? Because it really is benefit. But is that, when we say benefit, do we mean, spiritual benefit or right, benefit of getting a mitzvah? So we're going to assume right now, okay, and I'm going to tell you already that there's three different, you can see I charted it, besides kind of showing the flow here, I charted it at the bottom, the three different answers as to what's the debate between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda. Right now, we basically think the rabbis say you can't use a grave to benefit, and an eruv is a benefit. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not a benefit because mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu. So we're assuming the machloket is, are mitzvot lehenot nitnu or lav lehenot nitnu? So they question that and they say, Allah hada amar Rava, but Rava says mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu. Rava says the mitzvot are not lehenot nitnu. Now you could say he just holds by one side of the machloket, but lema kitanai amra l'shmate. If really there was a Tanaitic debate, are mitzvot given for benefit or not, then when Rava said it, we should have said, oh, Rava holds like Rabbi Yehuda in this machloket Tanaim, and it doesn't say that, which means it seems like everybody agrees about this principle, and it's not a machloket Tanaim. So Amar Lecha Rava would have to give a different explanation. What would he say? Rava would say like this. Everyone agrees that mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu. And if we say, and this is going to be the subject of debate, can you make an eruv just to go visit a friend, or can you only make an eruv to go do a mitzvah? So if you would say that ein ma'arvin ela lidvar mitzvah, you can only do it for a mitzvah, then everyone would agree that mitzvot are not lehenot nitnu. And yes, of course, you can put your eruv on a kever because there's no benefit from the grave. But this is the root of their machloket. Mar savar ein ma'arvin ela lidvar mitzvah, umar savar ma'arvin afilu lidvar hareshut. The whole debate between them is, can you make an eruv to go visit a friend? If you can, that's the chachamim. They say since you can't use an eruv from a grave because you're benefiting because now you can go visit your friend or do whatever it is you want. But if you hold that it can only be used for Dvar Mitzvah, that's Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, he says, since mitzvot are not considered benefits, therefore you could put your Eruv in a grave, no problem. So now they say, wait a minute though, that can't be a good answer either. And it's the same structure as they did before. They bring in someone who made a comment and they said, well, he never said there it was a debate among Tanaim, so it can't really be a debate among Tanaim, otherwise it would have said so. Elahada Amar Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, Ein ma'arvin ela lidvar mitzvah. He says very clearly you can only do an eruv tchumen for the purposes of a mitzvah. So according to him, again, lema ketanai amar lishmate. He should have said, right, that this is a machloket tanaim, or someone should have commented that. So Amar Lacha Rav Yosef. So answer number 3, Kulei Alma. Everyone agrees, Ein ma'arvin ela lidvar mitzvah. According to Rav Yosef, that's agreed upon, only for mitzvah purposes. And as we already established, Kulei Alma mitzvot lav le'enot nitznu, and there's no benefit. So theoretically, it should be allowed. So what are we left with? Trying to figure out why the rabbis don't allow this. Ubahak kamiflage. This is the root of their machloket. Mar savar kevan dekanale eruv lo nichale demintera. Basically, Rabbi Yehuda says, since, what do I want my food to be there for? I want my food to be there when Shabbat starts, so I could say, this is my place of dwelling for Shabbat, even though it's not really, but this is a symbolic way of saying, again, this whole Masechet is all about symbolic gestures, right? We have the lechi or the korah in the mavoi, which is basically saying, oh, this is as if there's a wall here. This is all as if. It's not for real. Nobody really thinks you're living there for Shabbat, and that was the whole debate we saw at Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, and Hananya. Right? Does Beit Shammai need you to bring all of your any kind of utensils you need for Shabbat to make it a much clearer statement that I'm living here for Shabbat? Or is it enough, right? We know in halacha all the time, we do lots of things that are symbolic. And a symbolic gesture by putting food there is sufficient. Since it's very symbolic and it's just I'm putting my food there so I could say this is if I'm living here for Shabbat, I don't really care what happens to the food after Shabbat comes in because I'm done at that point. So the fact that it's now being protected by the grave, I'm assuming that they're talking about burial caves, where I'm putting my food inside the grave. So if, right, not just on top of a tombstone, but I'm assuming that the grave is protecting my food. The question is, am I benefiting because my food's being protected? So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, because I don't really care. This actually sounds like the whole psik resha, deloni chale, right? And it's, if you're watering the grass, right, but you don't really want the grass watered, or right? If I don't, now that we always say is always nichale, so it's not a good example, but we brought it up there. Whereas if I'm not interested in my food being protected, I don't need my food to be protected because I'm done with my use for that food. So therefore, right, this goes back to also, do we care if it spoils? Right? We don't care if it spoils because I'm not planning to eat that food. So if you say that, right, then I'm not benefiting, and then it's okay. But Marsava, the rabbis say, Nichale de mintera, di itzrich achile. Since I'm putting out food here, maybe I'll want more food on Shabbat. And maybe when I'm on my walk, right, this is classic, you want to walk on Shabbat, you can't carry. So what do? You put water bottles, right, in different places where you're on a marathon, right? You're not going to carry water with you. So they put stands where there's water bottles to take. So here, maybe I'll want to get my food while I'm on my way to where I'm going. So according to the rabbis, I am benefiting from the fact that the food's in the cave and therefore in the grave, and therefore I'm not allowed to benefit, and therefore I can't put it in a grave. Okay, new Mishnah. This Mishnah should sound familiar to you. I hope it does. We already saw this Mishnah in Shabbat, not exactly this exact Mishnah, but all the topics discussed in the Mishnah in Shabbat and in Brachot, and there was a conversation exactly that went almost identical to what we see here. Eruvin b'demai u'b'maser rishon shenitla trumato u'b'maser sheni b'hektish sheniftu v'hakohanim b'chala. You can use all the following items for Eruv. We're going to set up, and here I did a chart for you also, all the items one can use for an Eruv and all the items one cannot use for Eruv. So we get to all our classic categories of foods that are potentially maybe forbidden for eating, or maybe they're not, and whether you can eat them or not. And then we're going to get to what's the difference between them. And the Gemara is going to really ask for most of them, either why can we do this, or isn't this obvious, and why would they even need to tell you this? So let's go through our topics. Demai. Demai is something that we get from an Amma Aretz. Someone doesn't generally, we're not sure they keep halacha to the extent that we do. And we're concerned that for financial reasons, they're not going to take masrot from their food. So if you're not sure, you're supposed to take trumot masrot. But if you didn't, we allow you to use it for your Eruv anyway. Maaser rishon shenitlat trumato. Your maaser rishon is the maaser you give to the Levi. Okay, I'm going to now give some background, and this will help you for what we're going to learn coming up. Right? There's different stages. You harvest the crops, you take them, you put them in bundles. Okay, that's called shibolim. We're going to get to that. Once you bundle up your wheat, you take them to the goren. The goren is the threshing floor. On the threshing floor, you do disha. That's called threshing, where we separate the wheat from the chaff. Then you're left with your wheat kernels. You take all those wheat kernels, you make a pile. This is going to be called the kri, the pile. When they're all piled up and you're finished, okay, I was thinking this is like when certain people, when they finish eating, they put their fork and their knife in a particular way on the plate to indicate I'm done eating. So when you're finished with the pile, you flatten the pile, and that's an indicator I'm finished. I'm not adding any more to the pile. There's different reasons given as to why you flatten the pile. Some people say it's because you want to measure it. It's much easier to measure things when they're not in a big, triangular shape, but they're flattened out, and then you can see exactly the way it is. Some other explanations given. Some people even think maybe Ruach HaKri doesn't even mean flattening the pile. It means something else, but we'll leave it at that. Most people say it's flattening the pile, and that's your indicator that I'm finished. Okay. Also, one of the other things they say is when you flatten the pile, it also gets rid of, when you separate the wheat from the chaff by winnowing, it's not a perfect science. You still end up with some of the bad stuff inside. So some of the chaff. So when you put them in the pile and you flatten it, it kind of gets rid of all the extra chaff. So that's when, at that moment, you're now obligated to do Trumot Masrot, because that's what we call Gemar Melacha. Before that, it's not Gemar Melacha. So now, what's the next? Okay, so we now have Ma'aser Rishon that you took Truma from. Okay, what does this mean? So now what happens? So you have your pile. You're now supposed to take Trumot Masrot. So what do you do? What's the order? What do you have to do? First thing you do is you take Truma Gdolah. That's what you have to give to the Kohen. There's no real measurement for it, but the rabbi said either average is 1 out of 50, right? There's Ayin Tovah and Ayin Ra'ah, whether it's 1/40th, if you're more generous, if you're more stingy, 1/60th. That's your range. You give that to the Kohen. Then you take 1/10 of what's left and you give that to the Levi. That's called Ma'aser Rishon. The Levi himself now has to take Trumat Ma'aser. Okay, it's called Truma on his Ma'aser. His Truma has a measurement. It's 1/10. He has to take 1/10 of what he gets, and he has to give that to the Kohen. Okay, it's an interesting lesson about, you get charity, you have to give also your own charity. So he gives to the Kohen his part. So that's exactly what we're talking about. Ma'aser Rishon shenitla trumato. Okay, that you took the Truma from. So again, the Gemara is going to ask, isn't that obvious? Once you take Truma, so it's the Levi's for any purposes he wants. Of course, he can use it for an Eruv. So it's unclear what they're trying to teach you. Uba Ma'aser Sheni v'Hekdesh Shenifdu. These are two things that you're supposed to bring to the temple. Your second tithe, which is the one you're supposed to bring to Jerusalem in years number 1, 2, 4, and 5, as opposed to Ma'aser Ani, which we just discussed the other day, which is the year 3 and 6. So after you've taken your first 10th to give to the Levi, after you took your 1/50th, then from what's left, you take your 1/10 to give to the Levi. Then from what's left, you take another 10th and you bring it to Jerusalem on years 1, 2, 4, and 5. But you don't actually bring it to Jerusalem. You redeem it on a coin. You redeem it on money. And remember, you take the value, plus you have to add a 5th, okay? An extra 5th when you're doing the pidyon. So we now have Ma'aser Sheni or Hekdesh. If I say I'm sanctifying this book to the temple, I don't actually have to bring the book to the temple. I have to just bring the value of the book to the temple. So again, when I redeem it on a coin, what happens? The fruits or whatever it was, or the book or whatever item it is, becomes what we call chulin. Any sanctity that was on it is now removed because I moved the sanctity onto the coin. So of course, I can use it for an Eruv. It makes a lot of sense. This is challah, we give to the Kohen. We know when we're mafresh challah, it's supposed to go to the Kohen. Nowadays, we don't do that, but it's supposed to go to the Kohen. So the Kohen, that's his. If he wants to use it for his Eruv, no problem. Here's all the cases that are the flip of the cases we discussed, other than challah. But not with tevel, things that you didn't take Trumot Masrot from. Those are forbidden to eat, so you can't use them for your Eruv. Ma'aser Rishon that you didn't take Truma from, so the Levi can't eat it till he takes his Truma. And not Ma'aser Sheni or Hekdesh before you redeem them. Okay, again, those are going to be pretty obvious. You can't eat them, so of course you can't use them for your Eruv. So we're going to start with the Gemara. The first question, and I put it on the chart next to each one, I put the question on it and the answer. Demai, halo chazele. You can't eat demai, you have to take Truma Masrot. How can you use it for your Eruv? It should be on the other side of the Mishnah. So the answer, if you want, you can basically on Shabbat say, I'm giving up all my possessions turn yourself into a poor person, and poor people can actually eat demai. If you remember, we learned this already. And then it would be hashanami chazele, and then you'd be able to eat the demai without taking truma namaschot. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, right? Even though I just said before that the aniyim have to do their own staka, but not if it's a suffix. Okay, if you're not sure and you think maybe truma namaschot were taken, then the ani doesn't have to do that. We exempt him. Ditnan machilim et aniyim demai, and remember ve'et achsanya demai. Also, the soldiers don't have to take the demai. Amar Rav Huna just adds another thing here. Tana Beit Shammai omrim em machilim et aniyim demai, Beit Hillel omrim machilim et aniyim demai. Beit Shammai in typical fashion, right? He's a little bit more stringent. He says no can do. Aniyim can't have to take truma namaschot on demai. They can't eat demai as is. But in any case, our Mishnah obviously follows Beit Hillel. Next case, Maaser Rishon Shenitla Trumato. So the Gemara says Pshita. Isn't that obvious? Once he takes the truma, it's very obvious. Okay, this is the complicated part for today. I tried to make it easy by giving you all the steps before to kind of set you up for understanding this a little easier. It's a case where the Levi comes along, okay, at an early stage, before I started taking Truma Namaschot, before I'm obligated to take Truma Namaschot, when it's just in the bundle stage. What happens? The Levi comes along and takes his 10th, okay? I haven't yet taken my Truma Gdolah. So theoretically, what does the Levi have to do? He should have to take his own Truma Maaser, right? The 10th he's supposed to give to the Kohen. But what about the Truma Gedola? Okay, so the Mishnah talked about a case where Maaser, that Nitla Trumato, he took the Truma Maaser. But what wasn't taken here? The Truma Gedola. So maybe the Levi has to take Truma Gedola. So they're now going to say, if Ikdimo b'shibolim v'nitla mimenu Truma Maaser v'lo nitla mimenu Truma Gedola, we're basically saying the case is, okay, we're going to narrow the case of the Mishnah. Otherwise, it's obvious. So it must be talking about to teach you that even in a case where the Levi came early and took his stuff before I was even obligated in Truma Namaschot, and he took his portion and then gave a 10th of his portion to the Kohen, but the Truma Gedola was never taken from that produce, he doesn't have to take the Truma Gedola. Okay? And we'll see the Amar Rabbi Avau Amar Rish Lakish Maaser Rishon Shikdimo b'Shibolini describes exactly this case. Maaser Rishon that he took before you got the bundle, before when it was still in the bundle stage and it wasn't obligated yet. Patur mi Truma Gdola. Where do we learn this from? Shneimar. I hope you remember this. We learned this before. V'harimotem mimenu Trumat Hashem Maaser min haMaaser. What does it say here in singular form? Take the tithe from the tithe. In other words, he has to tithe his own tithe that he gets. Okay, he has to take the maaser from the maaser. Notice it says maaser in singular. Maaser here is used as truma, right? You follow maaser and truma can sometimes be interchangeable. Maaser min maaser amarti lecha v'lo truma gdola trumat maaser min maaser. It's only one. It's only trumat maaser. It's not both trumat maaser and truma gdola. It's singular form. This pasuk, okay, I'm going to put it like this so you're clear, because this part might be understandable now, but it'll get confusing in another minute when we bring a different verse. This verse is limiting. Okay, that's the most important thing you need to know. Why is it limiting? Because it says maaser in singular form. That teaches you that if hikdimo b'shibolim, and he took his portion, and he took his own truma from, but he didn't take, I never took my truma gdola, he doesn't have to take my truma gdola portion and give it to the Kohen. And that's all because why? Because it hasn't yet been obligated in Truma Namaschot. So now the Gemara says, so here, maaser min maaser, Truma Gdola, below Truma Gdola. Okay. Amalei Rav Papa Labai. So Rav Papa now comes in questions. Ihachi, if you're saying that this pasuk limits, and it sounds like the Levi never needs to take more than one maaser, really more than one Truma. So, afilu ikdimo b'kli nami. What if the Levi, when it gets to the pile, and I've already flattened the pile, and I'm obligated in Truma Namaschot, and instead of the order I said before, where I'm supposed to take my Truma Gdola, I didn't yet get to it, and the Levi takes his 10th. Now the Levi will probably be obligated in doing the Truma Gdola. But how could you say he'll have to bring two Trumot? He'll have to bring the Truma Gdola and the Truma Maaser, right? The logic being, well, at that point, it was already obligated, and that portion, again, he won't have to take Truma Gdola on all of my wheat, but he'll have to take it on the percentage of wheat that he took. He'll have to take a small portion and give to the Kohen. So now, if you said maaser min maaser and not two maasrot, then Even hiktimo b'kli nami, it sounds like from your drasha, he'd never have to take truma demas. He wouldn't ever have to take truma gdola. How could that be? So Amalei, Alecha Amar Krai answers it back. Abaye says to him, there's another verse, and that verse is an inclusive verse, right? This was it was excluding cases. This was saying just maaser. Here we're going to see a verse where it talks in plural about maaser. So we're going to say the limiting pasuk is limiting that case, and the pasuk that includes more cases is including the case of hiktimo b'kli. So he says, Mikol ma'asrotechem tarimu et trumat Hashem, right? And ma'asrotechem, notice, is in plural. And, right, it seems to say, right, bring the trumat Hashem and all your ma'asrot. It sounds like bring more truma. In other words, the Levi could also theoretically sometimes have to take truma gedola and trumat maaser if he came and took his pile once it was already obligated in trumot masrot, and I hadn't done it yet. So now the Gemara says, which it's a bit of a weird question because we kind of know the answer, so kind of assume we don't really know the answer yet. Umara'ita, why, right? What they were saying is it sounds a little arbitrary. You have one verse that says only one. You have another verse that seems to imply multiple. So why did you apply that one in Hikdimo b'Shibolim and this one in Hikdimo b'Kli? That's why wouldn't you reverse the two? So the obvious answer is Hai Idgan v'Hai Lo Idgan. That was already in a pile and obligated in Truma. And that's why he has to take Truma Gdola in that case. Whereas in the previous case, it wasn't yet in a pile. And therefore, now where does the word Dagan come from? What's the relevance to Truma? Because it says Reshit Digancha Tiroshcha. It's the first of your pile of grain. So it's only going to be once it's already in a pile and it's already ready. And that's why only in that case he would have to take it. Okay, next case in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't this obvious? No, because once you redeem, remember, they become chulin. Of course you can use it for Eruv. So the answer, Lo tzricha shenatanet hakeren velo natanet hachomesh. It's a case, remember I told you, you have to give the value. Let's say I have 100 shekels worth of value of fruits. So I pay 100 and then I have to add another fifth, okay, which is really a quarter. Again, we'll get into that when we see it inside, but it really is another 25. So I have to add 125 because what happens then, right? 125, then it's a fifth. 25 is a fifth of 125. They always view it from the outside, from the bigger amount. So let's say I paid the 100, but I didn't pay the 25. You might think that maybe they're not considered redeemed yet. Comes the Mishnah to tell you, even in that case, they're considered redeemed. It teaches you that if you don't give that extra fifth, it's still effective. Your pidyon, your redemption works, which means that your money now has sanctity and your fruits no longer have the sanctity on them. Avalo b'tevel. Now we're moving to the second half of the Mishnah, all the cases that don't work. Pshita, isn't that obvious? Lo tzricha b'tevel tavul midrabanan. Ukigon shezaram batzit she'eino nakuv. This reminds us of things we've learned before. If you have a potted fruits, vegetables growing, and it doesn't have a hole in it, means it's not getting any nourishment from the ground. It's only obligated in masrot from rabbinic law. You might have thought maybe it's okay to use for your Eruv, since by Torah law, this is edible, even though by rabbinic law it's not. Kamash Malan is coming to tell you, no, you can't use it for your Eruv. Right? If you haven't yet taken Truma, then no. Isn't that obvious? Again, Pshita. Of course, if the Levi hasn't taken his Truma, of course it's going to be a problem. So what do they answer? It's going to be the reverse of the previous sugya. Lo tzricha shiktimo b'kli. It's to teach you that what we're specifically talking about, he took his 1/10 and gave it to the Kohen. What he didn't do was, it was a case where he took it before I gave my Truma, and it was already in the pile, flattened pile, and he didn't take Truma, Gedola, but he did take Truma Maser. Can't use it for the Eruv because he has to take Truma Gedola. So they're going to think, why isn't this obvious? So again, Ma'u Detema, now going back to the previous sugya, Keda Amale Rav Papa Labai. Remember Rav Papa said to Abaye, well, if you're going to say Maser Mina Maser, only one Maser, maybe he doesn't have to take Truma in this case. Kamash Malan Kedeshanele. So the Mishnah is teaching you, just like Abaye answered, there's two verses. One includes, one excludes. We're going to go by the inclusive one in this case and say they're going to have to take Truma in this case. The Loba Maser Shani V'Hekte Shaloniftu. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't this obvious? If you didn't redeem them, of course they're still sanctified. And of course you can't then use them for your Eruv. Lo tzricha shepda'an velo pda'an kil chatan. You redeem them, but you didn't do it in a halachically valid way. Now, this is kind of funny because you would think, of course, if I didn't do it in a halakhically valid way, it doesn't mean anything. But here they're suggesting that maybe you'd think, even if it's not, I didn't do it exactly right, but I did it somehow, and maybe even though it's not the ideal, maybe it kind of works. And this is teach you, no, it doesn't work. Okay, so what would be shelo kil chatan? Ma'asir shepte'o gabe asimon. And asimon, right, we know the asimon from the old Israeli phones, public phones, but what it is, right, what's the difference between an asimon and a regular, besides it had a hole in the middle of it, but it had no what's the word, engravings on it, right? Coins always have something engraved on them. So maaser can't be redeemed on a coin without engravings. The assumption is that it doesn't have as much, it doesn't have a value so much if it doesn't, but that's what a coin is. It has something on it. Urachmana Amal, and the pasuk says, Vitzarta kesef. What is Vitzarta kesef? Kesef sheyesh alav tzura. Okay, it means kesef that one has, tzarta, okay, the simple reading is that tzarta means put it in a bundle, and take the kesef in your hand and take it to Yerushalayim. But the root of tzal could also mean tzura, a form. So they darshan from here, it has to be money that has a form on it, an engraving. Hekdesh shechilelo agav karka. What would be hekdesh that you did it, redeemed it not k'halacha? It's when you redeem it onto land instead of onto money, right? Land has value, money has value. So theoretically, you might think you could redeem it on land. Derachmana amal, v'natana kesef v'kamlo. The pasuk says, v'natana kesef, meaning you have to give the money. And then kamlo, and then it goes back, whatever you sanctified goes back to become yours. It's a bit of a problem here with the fact that they say the Torah says this. There's actually no verse that says this. Okay, so there's a bit of a question what exactly this is, but we'll leave that aside. It's kind of a paraphrasing of a different pasuk. Okay, moving on to a very interesting topic. We know in halacha there's always this category of cheresh, shoteh, v'katan. Okay, someone who's deaf, who's generally considered a deaf mute. Okay, both can't hear and can't speak. A shoteh, someone who doesn't have proper functioning of brain function, cognitive function, and a katan, and a minor. Okay, so they're always put in this category, and there's big debate nowadays. In fact, in Daf Michelle Farber, they dealt with it in a very interesting way about showing this week, Shiur and Chamutal talked about specifically the cheresh and halacha, about nowadays we know a lot more about hirshim and even about shoteh, right? People with disabilities and cognitive disabilities. There's a wide range, and it doesn't mean just because you have cognitive disabilities that you're not considered a bar da'at in halacha. And there's a whole debate nowadays about how we view this, how the halacha moves with the changing times, and it's not like anything's really changed. It's just our perception of these people and what their capabilities are is different, right? We know that there's, when we talk about it, right, we all, so to speak, have disabilities, and it's just a matter of where we fall on the scale about where things are. So whereas in the halacha and the Gemara is not very politically correct when they speak, right? They kind of just say it as, you know, you're in this category, you're in a box. We nowadays know that there's no such thing as boxes and categories like this, and things are much different than it was then. In fact, my favorite story is in the beginning of Chagiga, where they talk about these two people who were mutes, and they sat in the shiur always nodding their heads, and everybody thought they knew absolutely nothing. And then they felt bad for these guys, and they prayed for them, and they were healed. And all of a sudden they knew, and it even says, Kol Hashas Kula. Okay, they knew all of Shas, and they clearly were with the program. So even the rabbis had an understanding, which I think is fascinating, that it's not as simple as it seems. Okay, however, despite that, they still put them into categories and said, okay, these people don't have proper knowledge and therefore can't function as a halachic, right? They can't be a shaliach, which we're going to see today. They can't be your messenger to put down your eruv. And we're going to talk about this. So again, it's very interesting nowadays how the poskim have changed their perception of these categories based on, and that's what Shiur and Chamutal really discuss in Daf Michelle Farber this week. So the Mishnah says, Hasholech eruvo b'yad cheresh shoteh v'katan. O b'yad, here's an interesting one that gets added to this category. Misha eino modeh be'eruv. Someone who doesn't believe in eruv. Okay, this basically means someone doesn't believe in what the rabbis say. Okay, it doesn't accept Torah Shabbat Peh. So if you do it, you send them to put your eruv down in the place, Eino eruv, doesn't work. There's an assumption here also that when you get to the place where you want to put your eruv, it's not just enough to stick food. You have to say something like, this is where I'm going to be for Shabbat. And because these people are considered without da'at, without knowledge, so they can't put it down, or they don't believe in eruv, so we can't let them do it if they don't believe in it. We're going to assume that if they don't believe in it, when they put it down, they're not going to really have the right intent, okay? I think it's unclear to me, I think, maybe we'll see it inside, but where they get that you actually have to say. Maybe it's just intent. It could be intent in your mind, but either which way, you need some sort of intent that this is what you're doing. But if he told someone, if he told the katan or cheresh or shoter or the person who doesn't believe in eruv to give it to someone else, then it works. So now the Gemara asks, "The katan lo, it doesn't work with the katan. V'hama Ravuna katan goveh eruv." When it comes to eruv chatzerot, okay, and I see Shoshana, you asked earlier. I'm not exactly sure what you asked it because I only saw your question after. But is it eruv tchumin or eruv chatzerot? So if you remember, we started the parak. Rashi said this is eruv tchumin and eruv chatzerot, and Tosfot said, "What are you talking about? We're only talking about eruv tchumin here." So there's a debate all throughout. We do see that most of the sugyot seem to be talking about eruv tchumin and not eruv chatzerot, and here it's very clear they're talking about eruv tchumin and not eruv chatzerot because eruv chatzerot, if you give your food to the child, it works. What does it mean, give your food? Everybody in the chatzer, in order to be together, has to give their food. There's different reasons given as to why there's differences. What made the most sense to me was this, which is that when I give my food to be part of, to say I'm together with everyone, what's the most important moment? When I give my food. So I'm the one giving my food to the katan. The katan is just a messenger. I was thinking, it's Erev Shabbat and someone's got to go collect the food. The parents are busy in the house getting ready for Shabbat. They send the kid on the errands, right? Go get the food for the Erev. So it makes a lot of sense that the kid can do this because all they're doing is collecting the food. It's really the giving to the child that's the most important. But when you go to the Eruv Tchumin, there, it's not important when you give the food to be put down. It's when you put the food down. Then you need da'at for that. So that's the important moment. The katan can't function there. Okay, I see, Shoshana, you're asking about the benefit of visiting friends. That's only Eruv Tchumin. That's 100% Eruv Tchumin. Is Eruv Tchumin something that's only allowed for Dvar Mitzvah? Okay, moving on. Who's this? What kind of person are we talking about? Amar Rav Chisda Kutai, the Kutim, because they didn't believe in Torah Shabbal Peh. Those are what we call today the Shomronim. So now they have a good question. How do you know if I'm giving it to a katan, to give to a dina, let's say, okay? So I give my eruv to give to a dina. How do I know that katan is going to give it to a dina, right? So, just like Rav Chisda says somewhere else, it's only a case where I watch the katan going to give a dina the eruv, the food. Okay, so fine. I'm watching and I see the katan give a dina the food. How do I know that a dina is going to actually do what the katan asked, or maybe even I asked a dina before and I said, listen, later I'm going to send you some food. Can you put it down? How do I know she's going to do it? Right? I think the assumption is if I give it to you directly, it'll be more obvious. But if I just send it, maybe you won't accept it and you won't do it. Just like Rav Michelle says somewhere else, we can assume that the shaliach is going to do what the shaliach's asked. There's an assumption. And tomorrow we're going to talk more about this assumption. Likewise here, so now we're going to end with a kind of a funny story or funny situation. We keep saying, like they said somewhere else, like they said somewhere else. Where did they say this? So they say, on the following thing, if you give it to let's say you have an elephant that you've trained or a monkey that you've trained and you say, go put it over there. So that doesn't work. Again, because when you put it down, you have to have dot. They don't have dot. And then they ask the exact same questions. If you give it to the monkey to give to someone else, then that works. So they say, how do you know the monkey's going to do it? It means you're seeing him. Maybe you won't accept it. So like they said it in the monkey and the elephant case, they would say the same thing here. It's fascinating. They're talking about this case. Anyway, we'll end here for today and we'll pick up with this concept tomorrow about can we always be sure shaliach is going to do what the shaliach is asked.